Hi there, I'm Mark Anderson. I'm the CEO of SNS, or the Strategic News Service, and it would appear that I'm the first person to have predicted the current global economic crisis. And the reason I'm talking to you today is that I, and probably you, have been frustrated for a long time with the lack of information about what's causing all this. And I thought it might be helpful to have a kind of 3 or 4 minute or so description of what created this crisis and how we got to where we are. So I'm going to do this in 3 parts because it really falls naturally into 3 parts. The first part you might call the problem. What caused the problem to begin with? What is the problem? The second part you might call the trigger man, who was critical in this whole story. And the third part you might call the crime itself. So let's start with the problem. This wasn't totally obvious to me or anybody else. But you'll recall, perhaps, last February 2007, there was a global equity collapse. Worldwide markets fell an astounding amount in just a day or two, and no one seemed to know why. If you read the Wall Street Journal, it told you that this was because China had reset the reserve requirements on their banks. Anybody with half a thought about economics quickly realized that was the wrong answer. Well, what was the right answer? And I began to worry about this. I was traveling at the time, and it occurred to me that Japan might be the answer, because if you looked around, you found that the Bank of Japan, run by a very nice man named Fukui, had just unannounced raised their rates by a half point. Japan, for about a decade, had had interest rates at essentially 0, and suddenly they popped the rates up a half point. Now you might say, who cares? It turns out, this is part of what I do at SNS, is it's an investigation story, really. This is a bit of a detective story. So why would the world care about this rate? Well, there's a thing called the carry trade. And in Japan, when the rates are 0, ask yourself if you wouldn't, if you're a business person, like to borrow money at 0 and then lend that money back out to somebody else at 5%. The answer, of course, is yes. So if that's the story, how much money are we talking about? No one at that time had a clue. But it would appear that there were a lot of people who were holding money, and when that rate popped up unannounced a half point, this so-called carry trade got a cold. And so Japan sneezed, the world got a cold. And this was an indication to me that there was an awful lot of money out there. It was being sold, equity markets were being sold out, that's why they dropped, so that people could convert back into Japanese yen to cover their bets out of this carry trade. Well, the world at large thought that it was a pretty small number. The Financial Times said the carry trade might be $250 billion. I thought it must be a lot more, so I looked a little more closely, and it turned out that the Bank of Japan tends to intervene, of course, as you probably know, in currency exchange rates. They don't like the yen to be favoring imports. They want to favor exports. And what they had suddenly done is intervened twice in a matter of days and completely given up. I had earlier figured that the Japanese were going to spend about $650 billion in the year 2007 in interventions. Well, if that was their budget and they gave up, what does that tell you? You can think of this as though it's a lever and a big rock. And the rock was a lot bigger than the world thought. So if the FT was saying $250 billion, suddenly I was thinking $1 trillion. These are, who holds these monies? These are hedge funds, sovereign funds like the Saudis, private equity plays like Carlyle Group. A lot of money was moving around. The world was very, very liquid. And yet it was possible for one guy who no one ever heard of to disrupt all this in a matter of minutes. So I finally made a guess, $1 trillion. I later revised that up. Now we know, a year and a half later, the real number in derivatives and other instruments like this is about $62 trillion. So the result of all this is, one guy could make this happen. It meant 2 things to me. First of all, although it felt as though the world liquidity was in a great situation, it was highly vulnerable. And not just that person, but maybe somebody else could cause troubles. So there's the basic problem. Then we go back to the trigger man. And it turns out Alan Greenspan, the trigger man, had been playing with our Federal Reserve interest rates for a long time. Starting in '99, he ran them straight up, then he ran them straight down after the NASDAQ collapsed, after 2001 attack, and he ran through what I call refi madness. He knew we'd be pulling, in the U.S., be pulling money out of our homes, which we all did. After a certain period of that, there's none left. Then what happens? Well, the next thing that happens is we kind of get toward the crime part of this, where it turns out banks realize what's happening. They start making more money on their fees than they're making on the loans themselves. The loans are offloaded to Wall Street. And at this point, you get shady loans, what people have called a subprime mess. This is a very small part of the larger story, but it's important. So now we're into the crime part of this, where Wall Street gets excited. The hyenas with PhDs get all over themselves, trying to repackage these things and sell them worldwide in ways which are not totally honest. So there are really two crimes there. At that point, something bad happens, which is foreclosures begin on people who weren't able to actually make these loans work. And the result is, we go back to the beginning of the story, that huge amount of money, that global liquidity crisis that we first foresaw and talked about on television back in February in London, now is turning out to be a house of cards going down. And as these foreclosures occur, the whole house of cards falls. We see small towns in Norway that owned instruments that were packaged improperly by Wall Street that have no value, and the towns go bankrupt. And this is happening all over the world. So what we saw as the potential fragility of the global liquidity scene became a catastrophe. And that's how we got to where we are today. If you'd like to learn more about this, you might go to stratnews.com, S-T-R-A-T News, or join us at our Future in Review conference at futureinreview.com. I'm Mark Anderson. Thank you.